A lot of things go on behind the scenes in the course of an election campaign, but one of the things that was going on was kind of a behind closed doors. There weren't even really doors, but a quote consultation on the future of free speech and regulating the internet in Canada. Now, you know, if you listen to the podcast, this is an issue we talk about all the time, including just the most recent podcast, where we were very concerned about what the government's legislation is going to mean. Legislation they talked about in the last session, but in their election platform, they committed to bringing back Bill C-10 and Bill C-36. They'll probably be called something else, but the objective will be the same. It is amazing how many groups from all sides of the political spectrum have gathered to express their concern and even oppose this. OpenMedia, the group we're talking to today, actually said that the government's approach to these issues is dangerously misguided. I couldn't agree more. So I'm going to have this conversation with Matt Hatfield. He's the campaign's director for OpenMedia. That is, they run online campaigns. The most recent one over this past summer was Say No to Canada's Censorship plan. Again, something with which I agree. Matt, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Where have we found you?
I'm coming to you from Salt Spring Island in BC here.
Oh, you lucky dog. That's beautiful. So OpenMedia is this group of concerned citizens, and I gather that you gather online and then find shared causes that you are concerned with.
Yeah, that's right. Ultimately, we're here to try to make the internet more the kind of place and space that people want. So we have a community of about 350,000 people across the US and Canada. We were founded in Canada and still do a lot of our work here. And I don't come to you in the spirit that I would like to say that Canada is so far off field in terms of how negative some of the ideas the government is proposing are here for our online expression.
This is an issue, like I'm puzzled, and I guess it's in part because I spent my life in the world of journalism where we argued against censorship and against restriction and in favor of free speech and the wisdom of people to choose what they want to read or watch or listen to. And this seems to be, the government's approach to this seems to be absolutely the antithesis. We are going to have Big Brother, Big Sister, however you want to describe it, looking at these literally billions of posts and tweets and emails every day and deciding arbitrarily what gets to stand, what gets to be out there as part of the public exchange.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunately fair. I think there's some space between what the government says rhetorically and what we've actually seen in terms of draft legislation, or in this case, a draft consultation around harmful content online. The harmful content consultation has what appears to be draft legislation in it that is a little bit more restricted to 5 forms of illegal content. But even there, we're seeing just unprecedented sort of breadth of power assigned to the government. And just really a lot of comfort with saying, I think the regulator in charge of content moderation actually has the power to compel platforms to do or not do anything it wants in fulfillment of its mandate, which is a very, very broad power to give to the regulator and concerning for how it could be misused in the future.
Well, that was part of our concern, and we don't know exactly who will be the minister on this file, whether Mr. Guilbeault continues. But he was really maybe, blunter than he intended to be. But he basically said, if you're critical of government, if you're critical of ideas that we support and like, we want to be able to take you down. That's truly reminiscent of, what can I say, China.
Yeah, I don't think that Minister Guilbeault has proved to be a great ally of the government in advancing some of their ideas. I think he's spoken very loosely at times, and it's unclear when he's speaking for himself or for the government more broadly. But we can only react to what we're actually getting, and what we're getting is these statements from him that are concerning. What we're getting is legislation that, although more narrowly developed, still poses some really concerning questions about what it would mean for the power of the government in the future, and about the, I think one of the things that frustrates us greatly is the government doesn't seem to be accounting for the predictable consequences of what they're proposing on what platforms will do. So they will say platforms should take down the bad thing, But we know because of the way they've set it up, platforms are going to take down much more than just the most harmful content, because their business incentive is to minimize risk to themselves.
Right.
So if they have a lot of risk, if they accidentally leave something up, but there's no counterbalancing incentive to defend freedom of expression, of course they're going to take down anything that's at all potentially, even in a very unlikely scenario, could qualify as in violation of these rules.
But you also can't believe that big tech, as powerful as they are just going to roll over and say, oh yeah, okay, we'll just become this namby-pamby forum where people exchange pictures of, dessert. They're going to want the kind of exchanges that now occur. I mean, regular, normal, non-hate, induced conversation and exchange, because that's what they do.
It is to some degree. I mean, I think what's interesting in looking at big tech's response, and it is a bit different platform by platform, is that they're sometimes a great ally of people's freedom of expression and sometimes not. And really, their core motivation is to defend their business model. What they want to do is for you to spend as much time as possible on their platform so they can sell advertising to you and gather information about you to sell to others. So to the extent that defending your expression will encourage you to do that, they're on board. But we've actually seen platforms like Facebook repeatedly encourage more regulation for a number of reasons. One is because most of this regulation doesn't actually hurt Facebook's core model. It hurts ordinary people's expression more than Facebook. Yeah. And two is because Facebook knows that some of these obligations may be extremely difficult to do, and they'll be difficult for Facebook to do, but they'll actually be even harder for any smaller platforms to do. So it's actually, the government is talking about platforms and saying that they're taking them on and they're going to reduce their power. They're actually potentially entrenching Facebook and making it far more difficult for another platform. Yeah, exactly.
No. Okay. So this week, of course, we've seen all of the hype around Facebook with the whistleblower and very compelling documents that she leaked to the Washington Post and then went on 60 Minutes and, of course, then testified in front of Congress. So I'm glad to hear people talking about that issue. We don't need to be telling young girls that they need to be skinny and cute in order to survive and succeed in the world. So we can target that. But I also just fear that it becomes cover, kind of almost a Trojan horse for this other stuff, where they can bring in an awful lot of restriction on free speech under the guise of protecting young girls or young boys.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the government is saying, look at all this bad stuff that's happening online. It's very serious. We need to do something, and this is what we're doing. And they're sort of skipping the intermediate step of having a real public debate about, like, okay, we have these problems. What's the nature of these problems? What would actually help with these problems? And what will be the consequences of some of the ideas we have for dealing with them? So they're kind of trying to take advantage, I would say, of our frustration with online platforms and our frustration with awful content online, and just sell us on this very particular scheme that actually, I've read dozens of submissions from academic experts and other groups to the government's consultation. I haven't seen a single group or expert say that they thought this was perfect or even good. Even people who do want more regulation think the government has approached it in a really backwards and potentially damaging way.
Okay, just drill down on that a bit. So, because I've read the material too, and everybody is saying, okay, don't, we agree on some level, but you're going at this with a 2-ton truck. And it's going to have it's not going to have the impact or the desired effect. So what's your main concern and criticism?
Oh, tough to drill down. I mean, we have a number of really serious concerns. I think the concern that we knew we would have is just really this over removal of lawful speech problem, because they've set it up such that they have a 24-hour takedown window for platforms where they will be penalized if they leave any illegal content up more than 24 hours. And that's just not enough time. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's the problem. I mean, I've put up a post, somebody's phoned and complained and said, I think it's racist or misogynist or whatever it may be. And these guys are just going to take it down. Why fight? Why call me? Why ask me to defend what I've said? Why have any debate?
So in principle, there is a council that you could appeal to if the platform took it down, and that council could say, this speech is not actually illegal in Canada in the end. You can choose to put it back if you want. The platform won't be forced to, but it will let them know that they could undo the decision. But firstly, will they actually choose to do that? They can just leave it off if they want to. Secondly, having your speech come back 3 months or a year or 2 years later, it in no way replaces the actual impact of your speech at the time. So we don't really think that redress mechanism is going to be adequate to tackling the problem.
So that's the first thing. And then there does seem to be, as I think you've read it and others have, an automatic referral of anything that somebody's complained about, anything that they have therefore taken down. That's automatically referred to police forces in this country. This is stunning.
Incredible, just astonishing. I can't believe that was the piece that we never expected, even with what we'd heard from the government in the lead up. That was kind of snuck in at the last minute. It absolutely does not belong in any democratic society. It would lead to the reporting of a lot of speech that is lawful to law enforcement, and there's no guidance whatsoever on what to do with that speech, whether they have to delete it after a certain amount of time, whether they're allowed to maintain files on people based off their lawful speech. We do have a history in this country of the police surveilling, and many would say over surveilling, marginalized communities, people in the Muslim community, Indigenous activists, environmentalists, and so on. And this would be actually an incredible tool for law enforcement to surveil perfectly legal activities of some of these communities that are targeted.
I think the thing that troubles me is, again, nowhere in here, and it wasn't in the first round of legislation we saw either, are actual definitions. We have hate laws that exist, and so we know that what that is. And if there is an attack on someone, either verbal or physical, that is racist and targeted at a group, that's pretty clear. But when we start talking about online harms, and that it's harmful or that it's hateful or that it's, and then the next word is, and it's terrorist, and then, this is a very long continuum, and this seems to be kind of pushing everything far too close together in terms of definitions.
You're absolutely right. I think one of the things that we found most alarming is the confusion of harmful content online and illegal content online. We think that you can have solutions, or you can talk about approaches to both, but they need to be kept separate. And ideally, different types of content within those categories also should be discussed separately. So there's such a thing as illegal hate speech in Canada. There's obviously such a thing as terrorist content, incitement to violence, that kind of thing. The solutions that are appropriate to these different problems are actually quite different, and that's part of why we're concerned about the law enforcement referral aspect. But also, it's just a situation where I don't know. The government seems to have gone off on a bit of a garden path, if you know that metaphor, where they thought they were doing the right thing. They convinced themselves they were doing the right thing, and they've just piled on more and more powers over time to it. And with the, if you trust in them, with the confidence that they will only use these powers for good. If you don't trust in them, then you should not trust that they will only use those powers for good. Of course, we live in a democratic system, and this government may be replaced by a different government in the future. So no one should be fully confident in the powers that are being issued here. And it's not going through a democratic process. The only real question that was raised by the public consultation was the question of, should law enforcement get material referred to them for all the 5 harms, or only when there's a direct threat to life or to violence. So it would be better if it weren't for all the 5 harms, but that's actually the only thing that the consultation really asks. Otherwise, more than a consultation, it reads like a list of things that they're going to do, and we can kind of get stuffed if we have opinions about it.
Yeah, we'll read it, and then we'll put your little submission on a shelf and carry on with what we were doing. I mean, in the discussions they had about the 2 bills, there was really going to be a censor czar as well. I mean, they sort of at one point put it through the CRTC, but then had this digital watchdog, which is, of course, going to create a whole bureaucracy. It's not like this is going to be 5 people in an office monitoring billions of communications. So then you start to create, if it's If it's not kind of troubling in its intent, it then simple intent, it then becomes this huge, massive bureaucracy.
Well, it's funny you should mention 5 people, because for the Digital Recourse Council that people can appeal their cases to, it actually is described as 5 people, which I find an incredibly unrealistic idea for how to manage that volume of cases that they're going to be receiving. But no, I agree with you. I mean, the amount of bureaucracy you would require to even do a decent job of this is astonishing, and there's no way that our government is well prepared to take it on at this point.
Well, that's what the Facebooks of the world tell you. They've got hundreds of people, thousands of people doing this. So when we talk about these online harms, and rather than going down this road of censorship, let's just shut it down, regardless of who initiates that. Most people in democratic societies want transparency. They just want this to be open. Tell us what your algorithm does. Tell us how it works, so that I know why I'm seeing all this stuff on my feeds, or why someone is even reacting to it this way. It might be coming up in a completely different context that I hadn't intended.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's by far the most important thing that we need at this point. We simply don't know enough about what's happening on platforms and how some of these problems are playing out on them. And that's intentional. It's not in the business interest of platforms to tell us about ugly things that happen on their platforms. So we do need
sausage, right?
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
And the sausage they're making, it's not good democracy or good political debate. It's ad clicks. So we do need, we shouldn't be relying on whistleblowers to reveal some of the ugly stuff that we found out about Facebook. We do need legislation that would force real transparency on them, not just to a regulator, but to their users, and also to researchers who can go on sort of deep dives on the data and like really figure out things that Facebook doesn't necessarily want us to know about what's happening on their platform, but that we do need to know in order to come up with better solutions to some of the problems that are happening there.
Because that kind of transparency, that's not unprecedented. I mean, we've watched the big drug companies during COVID and the development of not just the vaccines, but also perhaps medicines. They have to show you every test. They got to tell you how many people and how long they tested the product on that and what the results were. And they have to share that even with their competitors.
Yeah, and actually the comparison to drug companies is a good one, because obviously they have some ugly incentives that we need to balance out through public regulation. But people sometimes use the comparison to tobacco companies. And I think that's a bad comparison, because tobacco, it turns out, is something we could give up. Good public discourse is not something we can give up. And untrammeled public discourse without the government deciding like one standard, one that everyone will maintain for politeness, is not something that we can really easily take in a democratic society or as a global norm.
This is, I guess, what troubles me, and we've had this conversation on the podcast several times, but who makes this decision? When I hear political ministers say, oh, that's offensive, that is harmed me, that's misogyny, that's hateful, it is also in the eye of the person saying or posting that, their view of the world, their criticism of that person's views, not the criticism of whether they're a woman or whether they're, share this view about the climate or share this view about other forms of politics. It's, I don't agree with your point of view, therefore I'm not going to vote for you. That debate should be going on in countries, particularly during elections. It's kind of late after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems we're having with online speech right now is just the disappearance of context. So it often feels like everyone is in the same room at all times on the internet, and you and I are having some sort of civil discussion, and someone chimes in about their dog and someone else has something really rude to say. And I think more than illegal speech, that collapse of context is really making things feel both very chaotic and very uncivil. And so I think there's work to be done in terms of platforms finding ways of reintroducing context and giving people more options to shut out some of the voices that they don't want to hear, if that's their personal choice. But it can never be the government making those decisions. Like, the government is the worst possible actor to make those decisions, because we can't have the government saying, this is the line of civility and you don't go over, this is exactly it. it means that you can't go very far past that line either as well. So like some platforms for some people might actually want them to be very much a safe space, and that's
Mhm.
okay for that platform. But we can't set that as a norm throughout society necessarily.
Right, because there have to be other debates. I mean, that's part of the discussion that we heard about Facebook is that, and we saw the two sides, the whistleblower saying they exploit anger, not necessarily hate, but anger, because that drives clicks and then that attracts advertisers. And Mark Zuckerberg coming back and saying that's the antithesis of what we do. Why would we want to make and anger the advertisers? We want their money, so we don't do that. So somewhere in the middle is the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Facebook, they don't want the most vile content on the internet, and they don't want people going out and committing acts of violence, but they certainly benefit from a degree of polarization,
Sure.
from getting people to stay hooked to their seats because they're having a really intense emotional discussion. Again, very difficult to set sort of a speech standard or a government standard that would get rid of that. I think what we need is a lot more accountability into what Facebook knows about what's going on their platform, so that like
Exactly.
you
Yeah.
see it with Instagram Kids, like
Yeah.
Facebook said, oh, well, we're not doing that now. Well, good. That's a better outcome because what they were going to do was going to be very detrimental to children, but it wasn't from government regulation. It was once it became clear what the actual consequences were of what they were doing to the public, they were
Yeah.
shamed out of doing that thing. And just as a general picture, I think one of the things we're concerned about and really frustrated with the government around is that they talk a great talk about taking on tech giants, and actually when it comes down to it, they want to ally with tech giants. They want to use the power and the monopoly power of tech giants to the government's ends, to their speech ends, to some of their cultural ends. They are not
And
interested
political
in.
ends. Let's be clear.
I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
you can make the arguments. I don't want that to be the case, but you could
No,
certainly
me
make the
neither.
argument. Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, what we would like to see is the government make changes to the ecosystem that are actually more about empowering people and users in Canada and giving us more decision-making power over what's done with our data, over what our own experience is of being on platforms, who can see our posts, how our feed is constructed, that kind of thing, which would really, I think, both reduce the chaos of social media, but also just be fundamentally profoundly empowering of democracy and of citizens in a way that just seems to have fallen off the agenda.
So you could do that. I mean, to a certain extent, we can all do that now. I mean, if I'm on Twitter and I'm in the midst of a conversation about Bill C-10 and somebody comes in and says something quite vile, I can block that person. But you're suggesting more and stronger, what controls or powers for the actual user?
Yep, more power, more insight, more rights with your data. So like you can block people, it's true, but you can't see when. So there's actually, Twitter is a different example because they actually give a little bit
Yeah.
more control to users than most platforms do. But nonetheless, for most people on Twitter, their feed is constructed based off what Twitter thinks they want to see. What do you
Mhm.
want to see? Like not just what have you clicked, but like what is your conscious decision making about who you want to follow and where you want them ranked in your feed? It's perfectly within the power of Twitter to give you those choices. They don't, because they want to construct a feed that will keep you on Twitter as long as possible, not one that serves your needs. Well, that's something that we could regulate. We could give you that kind of power. We just haven't.
And I mean, can the Canadian government do that if the American government doesn't do that? I mean, that's kind of the problem with our narrow focus on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's questions of monopoly that it's true make the most sense to take on in the US, but there's definitely things we can do here in terms of how they have to run their operations within Canada that would reduce their monopolistic power for Canadian users. And if we're imagining very sweeping regulation on user speech that would require a lot of changes of platforms in Canada, it's reasonable to expect that we could have at least comparable changes made in order to empower users, not to silence them.
So what is the likelihood of that? I mean, you have said, your group in your presentation to the government, you said, if you go ahead with the stuff that you're talking about that we've already seen presented, this is going to make us the most censored and surveilled society in the world.
Democratic society, yes.
Yeah, democratic society. I don't think we want to have that distinction, do we? Or is that again a value judgment? Depends on who's hearing those words.
Yeah, well, it's unfortunately putting us a little bit more in company of countries, like Russia or like China or Iran,
Yeah.
who make very conscious efforts to control what their citizens see on the internet. I don't think if this bill passes, we don't end up there tomorrow. I'm not alarmist in that sense, but it certainly starts a really slippery slope, and particularly where the government is being given very broad powers that they haven't fully explained how they would use or where the limitations are. There's cause for concern. There's cause for concern about what this government could do or about how a future government could misuse it. I personally used to work on global free expression issues, and we used to have a sort of a clear line between democracy and autocratic governments. And these days, you see a lot more countries sort of on the slide from democracy into being less democratic. So a country like Hungary or like Turkey, where there's
Mhm.
still elections, but there's a lot of manipulation by the government of sort of how those elections occur. And again, I'm not saying Canada would be there after this bill, but it does concern me that it could be part of a process going in that direction.
Well, you do see this even in our neighbors to the south. I mean, obviously, big tech is more aligned with the Democratic Party. They support it. Everybody looks at who writes checks and the fundraising relationship. Donald Trump and his friends taken off a lot of these platforms. I mean, you could make arguments that for some of the tweets and some of the content, it could be taken off for other reasons, actually for harms reasons. But you can't just take your political opponents offline because you don't like what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. Certainly, I think if you look at the affiliation of the average big tech worker, there's clearly a lot of Democrats over there.
Yeah.
I think there's also evidence that some Republicans in the States have successfully scared the pants off big tech and have led to some Republican politicians being treated kind of with kid gloves in a way that they wouldn't treat you or I as average citizens.
Yeah.
We're a nonpartisan organization, and our focus is really like what kind of system are we setting up,
Right.
and how well would the system resist efforts to misuse it? We don't ever want to see a system brought in Canada where it works as long as the government has great intentions and is supportive of democracy. We want a system that is actually resilient in the terrible event that we do have someone in power who's trying to misuse it, that the system itself makes it harder to do that and really
Mhm.
supports continued citizen expression and freedom of speech.
And just keeps the government out of that. Someone suggested to me that what has gone on here is that um, France became kind of an example for Canada, the legislation they proposed, and we kind of took that holus bolus without looking at other stuff. And that legislation on which ours is based has been struck down by the French Supreme Courts. Like it just didn't pass constitutional muster.
Yeah, that's right. So it was found wanting for the exact reason I mentioned, that it would affect a lot of lawful speech, and that was considered an
Right.
unreasonable limitation. What Canada's kind of done, it's not just taking France, it's taken sort of a list of some of the wildest ideas that France and Australia and the UK have all considered, put them all in a list, and it's actually worse than what any of the others have done, more censorious than what any of the others have done. And they're just saying like this is what we're going with at this point. Hopefully they rein it in before it actually reaches draft legislation, but that's what we have right now.
So you've talked a little bit about what we can do, but let's say this legislation just gets caught up in the House of Commons and then the Senate, and it just sits there for the next couple of years while everybody debates this. What can we do when we hear the things like the discussion this week about Facebook, or when we are directly attacked online and we don't seem to have a way to respond to it? You're kind of this citizen activist group. Like, what can we do? What should we be doing as individuals?
Well, I mean, a couple things I'll say. One is don't discount raising your voice.
Yeah.
So I think we had, I believe it was almost 9,000 members of our community wrote into the government's consultation with their concerns around the proposal. That does matter.
Yeah.
Many dozens of different groups and academics also wrote in with detailed submissions. That matters as well. There will be many stages of seeing how this moves forward if they do move forward with it. I'm kind of interested to see what they do actually, given how universally critical the expert
Yeah.
submissions were. It would
From all perspectives, left, right, center, advocacy groups, the whole 9 yards. Nobody seems to like this.
Yes, and even folk who very much do want some regulation on online
Yeah.
platforms also thought this needed to be rejected. Um, I would have told you before I saw the submissions that they were going to ignore everything and push forward exactly as is. I think that will look particularly bad on them if they actually do that in this case, but it may still occur.
Yeah.
Even if they do, as you know, we had a huge debacle last year. I want to say last year. It wasn't, was it? It was about 6 months ago around Bill C-10.
Yeah.
And we could see, I hope we don't for the health of democracy, but we could see a replay of that with a bunch of debate and debate cut off in parliaments and them
It
trying
was
to
a
rush it
gong
through
show.
again.
It was an absolute gong show of people putting secret amendments
Yeah,
forward, and having the guys from their team vote for it, and then the other team. I mean, it gives Parliament, but it also gives democracy a bad name. I mean, that's not why we have this system. We have it so that we can have debate, not have debate.
so I mean, to that end, I would love it if the Canadian Heritage Department, once they've regrouped after the election, realize that they might have gotten off in the wrong direction on this, stop and actually go back and have a proper public consultation. I think we're not saying don't ever do anything around online platforms. And I think we're tremendously frustrated with the government, not just because we disagree with them, but just the way they've carried themselves in throughout. And really, it would be fine if they held a process that acknowledged some of the risks they were running and accounted
Yeah.
for it, and really let us hear that out, and then maybe move forward, maybe a bit slower, maybe in a more surgical way on a couple of these pieces. I think there's some really good ideas that some people have around addressing some of the specific harms that we could do. And I think number one thing, I'll just keep beating this drum. We just need to know more. Major online social media platforms that have only existed for 12 years or so now. We don't understand how they work well enough. We don't understand what's happening on them well enough. And the government could play a role in actually changing that a lot. They could force these platforms to give data to researchers, not just when they want to, but obligatorily. And they could force them to be much more transparent and accountable to the users of their platforms.
Well, I mean, they do. That's the thing that these huge private companies do, is they do superb research because it is key to their business model. And if we understood how it worked, or understood what the impact might be in our kids, because by the time people see it, it's too late. Even parents and family, I think that's why you get the reactions we see this week to a Facebook.
Totally. And it is terrible, some of the things that happen, but that's where the middle steps are getting lost. We're seeing,
Yeah.
oh no, this news story is really shocking and bad. We
Yeah.
agree. And the government's saying, and here's the solution.
Right.
And they haven't demonstrated the work that they need to show that it will actually solve the problems that they're doing. But no one has had the opportunity to actually form those links. And the government could play a role in allowing us to have actually well-founded research and actually well-founded policy proposals here.
You said something interesting earlier about the reason Facebook even made the changes that it did in reacting to, they're not supposed to have kids that are under 13 and all that kind of stuff on Instagram and all the rest, is because they got shamed into it. And they do have to listen to their consumers and to their users and to their board members and all of those things. It's hard to shame governments of any particular stripe. It's hard to shame them. This government could say, we just had an election. It was in our platform. We said we were going to do this. We got elected. Shut up.
They could do it. I mean, it is a minority government, so they can't do it without the support of at least one of the opposition parties. So certainly if it gets to that stage, we will be speaking to all the opposition parties and trying to explain to them why this is a bad idea. I don't think any of them have as much invested in it as they would have had in C10, which was seen as a winner in Quebec. But I don't think this is seen as a winner in Quebec necessarily. I think it's just currently the Liberal government thinks it will be a win on net for them to say, we did something about online hate.
We took on big tech.
Yeah. So really, it's important for us to be clear that we're not saying don't take on big tech. We're actually frustrated that they're not really taking on big tech. We would like them to take on big tech in a more meaningful way. And we'd like them to have a more thoughtful approach to addressing online hate that isn't just doing something sort of performative that sounds good, but is actually about helping victims and addressing the problem.
Yeah. Well, really interesting. And I think we're going to come back to you as this debate unfolds and see what you're hearing from your network of people and actually some practical things for people to do, because rather than take the big hammer, maybe there's some small things, and shaming those big companies might work at least a little bit. But we also need to understand how the technology works better than we do.
Yep, absolutely. And if people want to raise their voice, they're welcome to do it with us. They can do it by writing government consultations as well. But that's really what we exist for, to help people get their opinions and concerns to policymakers.
Really great, Matt. Thanks very much.
It's our pleasure.
Matt Hatfield with OpenMedia, running a series of campaigns. He's in charge of that, so you may want to look him up. The most recent one being saying no to Canada's censorship plan. Thanks for your work.
Absolutely.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Bye.
That is it for this edition of No Nonsense. We'll talk to you again soon.